Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. Welcome to the 2023 Civil Rights Conference at UT Martin. We're glad that you are joining us, and also we're glad that our friends who are watching us on YouTube are with us from around the country. Thank you. I'd like to remind you all about the I Am a Man exhibit at the Paul Meek Library here on campus. It features photographs of the Civil Rights Movement from 1960 to 1970. The exhibit is featured in the J. Houston Gordon Museum in the library and will continue through March 10th. I hope you all will get a chance to visit. It's right here on campus at the library. On Thursday, we will host a professional networking event for our students. We're bringing in seasoned people to talk to our students, people from different professions, and our students will have the chance to talk to them one-on-one and get a chance to meet them. Next Monday, John Ashworth, who's from Haywood County, my home county, he will be here discussing his research on the economics of slavery. Many companies and individuals are still benefiting from wealth that was generated during the era of enslavement in this country. In short, there are a lot of intriguing and interesting events that we have planned for you, and we hope that you will be joining us throughout the month. Tonight, you will hear from two of the most dynamic Gen Z historians in the country. They are changing up the approach to history in a way that should make us all take notice. But before we get to our program tonight, I'd like to ask Dr. Danny Donaldson to please come up.
Good evening. Tonight, we'd like to take a few moments to offer our gratitude to a faculty member who has served on the UT Martin Civil Rights Conference Committee for many years. He's contributed to the programs and panel discussions associated with the conference, sharing with audiences his vast knowledge and firsthand experiences of the civil rights movement. As a professor at UTM for more than 33 years, he has touched the lives of countless students, including me, helping to broaden and challenge their perspectives on race, equity, and justice. As my father-in-law, he is someone who continues to amaze and intrigue me with the many stories of his life. I'm still hoping he'll one day write that autobiography. Not only is he a student of history, but he's also been a participant in some of the country's most notable moments. The person we honor tonight is Dr. Henry H. Parker, esteemed professor in the Department of History and Philosophy at UT Martin. Here are just a few of his accomplishments. Dr. Parker graduated magna cum laude from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He received a master's degree from the University of Minnesota and a PhD in Latin and Greek from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. In one of his earliest acts towards racial justice, while working as a Pullman porter, he single-handedly desegregated the dining car department of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company and the bars and restaurants in Spokane, Washington. Continuing that same quest, Dr. Parker later produced and hosted Iowa's first Black television series, The Hank Parker Show, a show that became the state's most popular and influential program concerning racial understanding. He created and published the Parker Tribune, a newspaper used in 300 schools across the United States. He also created Parker Academy, a nationally recognized program created to increase standardized test scores in Waterloo, Iowa's all-Black public elementary school. With his wife, Marilyn Christ, he later developed the CP Collegians program, a program created for gifted children. Hearing the many complaints of ostracism and racial isolation by Black students in Iowa's small private colleges, he started the first statewide Black Student Association. The Iowa Association of Independent Colleges and Universities later hired him as the minority advisor to all of the college presidents in the state. In the late 70s, Dr. Parker served as the National Director of Curriculum for Jesse Jackson's Push Excel program. Recognizing the disparity in minority graduation rates, upon arriving at UT Martin, Dr. Parker created the Graduation Club, a selective program for minority students that focused on teaching skills needed to be successful in college and in life. He's the co-author of the following books: Teaching Minorities to Play the Corporate Language Game, A 20-Something's Guide to Financial Freedom, and The Secrets to Success in College and in Life. Dr. Parker is an international speaker and has published several other works in this country and abroad. His work has been included in the New York Times, USA Today, and People magazine. He was once featured on the Oprah Winfrey Show for his work in the field of hypnosis. He is a Ford Foundation Fellow and a Cunningham Distinguished Professor and Scholar at UT Martin. That is for a few more months. You see, after 67 years of teaching in higher education, Dr. Parker will retire in May. When once asked how he would like to be remembered, he stated, "I want to be remembered as a simple man." I think you'll all agree that his life accomplishments are anything but simple, and the ones I listed barely scratch the surface of all that he's done. Please join me in thanking Dr. Henry Parker for his contributions not only to the UTM Civil Rights Conference, but also to all of humanity. Thank you, Dr. Parker. And now we'll hear remarks from our great Chancellor Carver.
Dr. Parker and distinguished guest, just on behalf of the University of Tennessee, I think the highest calling of what we can do is to educate young people and push them to greatness. And when you look back over a teaching career that spans 7 decades of dedicating yourself to not only teaching and imparting knowledge, but most importantly, I think, mentoring students. And I think that's the hallmark of what we do at UT Martin. So on behalf of the university, thank you so much for investing 33 years. It sounds strange to say that, but also almost 70 years to the profession. So on behalf of all our students and all those students prior, thank you so much. God bless you. Thank you.
I thought it would be fitting tonight to recognize the work of a man who has helped organize previous civil rights conferences, participated in some historical moments, and educated so many young people about history. Dr. Parker's legacy is a good segue into our program. But before we do that, Dr. Parker, just so everyone can see you, would you make your way to the chair there? So if all of the members of the Civil Rights Conference Committee would come down. So Dr. Parker, So I'm glad we were able to do this for Dr. Parker. He certainly deserves it. So this was a good segue, going from Dr. Parker's legacy to our two presenters tonight. And we have two young presenters who are expanding the classroom through social media and promoting us and prompting us to think about history differently. To tell you a little bit more about them, I have enlisted the help of two of my students. Please welcome Michaela Pittard and Carter Van Drasik.
Good evening. Khalil Greene, also known as the Gen Z historian, has been recognized by the New York Times and Forbes magazine as a digital educator with over 30 million views across his TikTok, Instagram, and LinkedIn profiles. He has authored op-eds about social advocacy in the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Harvard Business Review. Khalil graduated from Yale with a degree in history and actually made history when he was elected as the college's first Black student body president. Khalil is now a full-time self-employed speaker, influencer, and educator, and is widely known for his TikTok series entitled Hidden History, which dives into stories of American injustice. He has also received attention for his commentary on U.S. politics. Khalil's hastened career is quite impressive. He has already worked with corporations like Meta and Microsoft. He has also worked on initiatives at the White House to help promote his messaging to younger Americans. Khalil's main goal is to share knowledge about history, culture, and politics from a youthful and engaging perspective. Please join me in welcoming to the UTM Civil Rights Conference, Khalil Greene.
Good evening, everyone. Tori Yates-Orr is an Emmy-nominated media host and producer and a history communicator. She is a self-described mythology nerd and channels her love of history into energetic podcasts. Her mission? To make history educating, engaging, entertaining, and accessible for the general public and younger audiences. History has always been her first love, from exploring her genealogy to receiving a degree in Africana Studies from the University of Tennessee. The past has always called to her. In 2019, Tori combined her skill set in production with her love of the past and started creating history lessons for social media. Her On This Day in History series has more than 1 million views. With a background in broadcast media and production, Tori has worked with brands such as HDTV, PBS, the CW Network, the Smithsonian, Spalding, and comicbook.com. She's the co-host of the Skeleton Keys podcast, and her history lessons can be found on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Tori is a film actor and a voice actor and has appeared in several national commercials. She's also a member of the editorial advisory board for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Please join me in giving a Skyhawk welcome to Tori Yates-Orr.
Thank you guys so much for the introduction. It made me sound way more accomplished than I actually am. First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be able to speak here. As a graduate of UT Knoxville, it's nice to feel at home here at UT Martin, albeit with a much more subtle level of orange, because that UT Knoxville orange is very loud. And at a time when how our country examines the past is headline news, it's important that we examine what History Reframed is all about. Because history is all about context, and the past helps us to understand the present. And for me, the past is personal. That's very young Tori. Now, I have been a lover of history since I was 8 years old, and I have my mom and a little girl in my second grade class to thank for it. See, in second grade, we had to go around the room and tell the class all about our background. And as the only child of color in the class, I was proud of where I came from. So with my 2 bushy pigtails and 2 missing front teeth, I stood up and I said, "I'm black, and I'm a little bit of English and Irish. My great-grandpa was a farmer, and my mom's on the news." I nailed it, honestly. Well, apparently, my words stuck with one of the girls in the class, who went home and told her mother what I had said. She then came back the next day and told me what her mother said to her. Well, she can't be anything but black, and black people were only slaves. And I went home with my Ninja Turtles backpack, confused. Now, I knew I had come from enslaved people, but they were my family. They had lives and dreams like everyone else. They were people. When my mom got home, she could tell something was wrong. I told her what the girl's mother had said, and my mom's entire face changed. She told me, "Sit right here. I need to go make a phone call." Now, this was back in the day when all of the parents had their numbers in booklets, and they gave it to all the classes. So my mom, being the brilliant, protective, black single mother she is, decided to give this other mom a call. And y'all, she went upstairs and she closed the door. So I knew it was serious. After about 10 minutes, she came back down, took a deep breath, and said, "Your ancestors were enslaved. They weren't slaves. They were people with dreams and hopes like the rest of us." People like my great-grandfather, Thomas Yates, with his wife, Fanny Yates. Now, Thomas was born enslaved in 1849, the result of the rape of an enslaved woman and the white man who owned her. Now, Thomas would go on to be a very successful farmer in Oklahoma and the father of 21 kids. Yeah, he was successful at a lot of things. Or people like my dad's father, Charles Orr, that's my dad up there, who trained to become a medic in the Army, only to be put on grunt work because they didn't want him touching the white soldiers. Strong women like my grandmother Ozell, who was very well known for her fiery mouth, but when racist firebombed their church group, threw her body over my mother's to protect her. And women like my mom, Vicky, an award-winning journalist who I remember having to hire people to scrub swastikas off our fence when we were little because we were the first black family in our neighborhood. Our history was one of struggle and triumph, she said. But she also reminded me, never let anyone else tell you who you are. The next day, she bought me books on ancient Egypt and Mali and powerful black women in history. And from then on, history became my best friend. It served as a touchstone for me. I might not know where I was going, but I knew that by looking at the past, I would find a way. History and the stories and patterns within became the lens through which I saw the world. And we're seeing those patterns right here, right now, even in our very own state. Now, with the tragic murder of Tyree Nichols, to the man who was shot 12 times by Nashville police in my hometown just the other week, the history of policing and the indiscriminate targeting of black men is something we've seen repeated throughout history. And to get the answers as to why policing has become brutal, or has always been brutal, we only have to use that historical lens to find the answers. Now, I did this next video in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, but sadly, it's just as relevant today.
Man on a long list of black men and women that have lost their lives at the hands of the police. But why are black people disproportionately murdered by those who are supposed to protect and serve? Well, to gain some insight into this, we have to look back at history, at an earlier version of the police in America, slave patrols. Slave patrols started in 1704 in the Carolinas. They were groups of white men whose sole purpose was to hunt down runaway slaves and any black person who wasn't adhering to the slave codes. Now, slave codes were a group of laws to control and subjugate black people. And if they were found in violation of these laws, slave patrols had every legal right to beat, terrorize, or even kill them. Some of these violations could include traveling without a white person, getting together in a group, learning to read and write, or even getting married. Now, what's interesting about slave patrols is that they enlisted the help of any white man, no matter their socioeconomic status or whether or not they owned slaves. And by implementing a force that gave any white man legal power and jurisdiction over black people, a dangerous mentality was created. A mentality that some might say is still alive and well today in the vigilante murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Slave patrols ended in 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Now, post-Civil War, the slave patrols were gone, but the subjugation of black people wasn't. Now, the fear of black people having self-agency led to the creation of the KKK, who, funny enough, used to work hand in hand with the police in the South. And after decades of violence and terror against their people, black people started to move en masse up north, starting the Great Migration. Well, policing didn't get much better up north for black people. See, departments in cities such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia had primarily been concerned with protecting the wealthy and going after the new immigrant populations, which included the Irish, Italian, and the Polish. But when black people moved up north, the police focused on a more obvious enemy, creating a new racial hierarchy. Throughout American history, black people have been killed for just living their lives. Pre-Civil War, black people could be killed for getting together in a group or learning to read and write. Post-Civil War, black people were lynched for trying to register to vote or looking at a white woman. Now, black people are killed for going on a jog, sleeping in their own bed, playing video games with their nephew, or having a fake $20 bill. Police are supposed to protect and serve, but for black people, we know that's not meant for us. And we have 400 years of evidence to prove it. But now, with the entire world seeing and condemning the police brutality that has been a part of American culture for years, we have a chance to create a new system that is built to protect and serve all people. A system with less police and more community. A system where instead of our police force getting a new tank, our teachers get new supplies. A system that holds police accountable and is built on empathy and not systemic racism. A system that for the first time in American history can actually prove that Black lives matter.
Now, policing, as it is now, with its targeting of black people, is working exactly how it was designed. Now, this is not an anomaly. This is the standard. Slave patrols exploited racial hierarchies to give white men jurisdiction over black people. Now policing, the institution, has given police, no matter their race, that same sense of control over black and brown people. And once you see the connection of policing to its racist roots, you can't unsee it, which is exactly why you see states like Florida, Texas, and right here in Tennessee working so hard to make sure that you don't learn the truth about the past. And I've seen people not taking the attacks on history seriously. Well, it's just education, like what does it matter? But attacking what we're taught, attacking education is like in the Fascism 101 playbook. They know what they're doing. And I like to remind people, Governor DeSantis, who has pushed for the removal of certain black feminist, queer, and or radical authors from AP African American history, graduated from Yale with a degree in history. He and others like him know exactly what they're doing. They know firsthand how powerful learning about the past is, which is exactly why he and many like him are working to have it removed. Now, I never thought that in 2023, one of the most rebellious things you could do would be to read a book and learn about your history, but here we are. My grandfather Lucius used to say that education is the only thing they can't take away from you. Because once you know something, you can't unknow it. That's him, very handsome man right there, one of the 21 kids. Lucius had deep roots to his history. Born in Texas in 1900 with the family farm in Oklahoma, my Yates side has deep connections with the land out there. In fact, my family reunion last year was in Tulsa to honor the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Let me tell you, seeing Yates in the ledger of people who lost property is something that will stick with me forever. But like I said earlier, the past is personal and it evolves. Even the celebration of Juneteenth started as a celebration for Texan Black Americans and became a celebration for all Black Americans, and now is a federal holiday. Now, I did my first video on Juneteenth in 2019, and I actually had to come back and update it in 2020 and in 2021. Here it is.
And if you've been following me for a while, you know that I have done a video on Juneteenth for the past 2 years. And I didn't think I was going to need to do another one, but Congress officially made Juneteenth a federal holiday. This is Juneteenth, the remix. On June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas. There, he announced the decree that all of the slaves in Texas were now free. When the enslaved people heard the news, many were in shock, and others started to celebrate, creating the first Juneteenth celebration. Now, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but it took 2.5 years to reach Texas. Now, the question becomes, why did it take so long? Well, of course, communication was not as fast as it is now, but a better theory is that, in fact, the Texan slave owners knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, but neglected to tell their slaves as to ensure a good harvest. Even after the announcement, there were reports of African Americans being lynched for trying to leave their Texan slave owners, and some reporting that many stayed on purely out of fear. But still, African Americans chose to start a new tradition where they celebrated their freedom on Juneteenth. First things first, Juneteenth is very much a Texas holiday because, again, it took 2 years for people to learn that they were freed. So just like Megan, B, and the Nonstop Riders, put some respect on Texas. And I swear to God, any of you do 3/5 or even 40% off sales for Juneteenth,
we will burn Utica to the ground.
Now, what made up a Juneteenth celebration? Well, usually a reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, incredible speakers, and of course some great food and drink, usually a barbecue pit, because after all, it started in Texas. African Americans also made a point to dress in their finest clothing as to assert their dignity and new rights as African Americans. The celebration of Juneteenth ebbed and flowed, especially in the South, where it became quite dangerous to celebrate, but it had a resurgence during the Civil Rights Movement, and in 1980, due to the work of Representative Al Edwards, it became a state holiday in Texas. And listen, America has a tendency to take cultural holidays and make them caricatures. For example, St. Patrick's Day and people falling down drunk and dressing up like leprechauns. Or Cinco de Mayo, where people just put ponchos on and fake mustaches and sombreros. So I'm telling you right now, do not do that with Juneteenth. I swear to God, if I see anybody dressing up like Black people or doing some extra stuff,
we will burn Utica to the ground.
Listen, the gesture is wonderful, but they've made Juneteenth a federal holiday while preventing schools from teaching what it is really about. The fact that Texan plantation owners delayed telling enslaved people that they were free so that they could work them for 2 more years. Oh, and did they pass a bill on police reform, voting rights, reparations, student loan forgiveness, or anything else that would actually help African Americans? No, but we get a day off. So celebrate Juneteenth today. But remember, like Kobe said,
job's not finished.
We still have so far to go, like so far, in reaching true freedom for African Americans in this country. Making Juneteenth a national holiday is a great first step, but it's just a step. All right, bring us home 2019 Tori. I know for me, I didn't learn Juneteenth in school. I learned it from my family members, but we have to ask, why are we so uncomfortable talking about slavery? If we talk about slavery, we have to examine what and who built America. And we also have to examine the resiliency of a group of people that had their culture and heritage stripped away from them, only to create a culture that has become one of the most influential in the world today. Juneteenth is a day of remembrance, examination, and joy. It's a way to examine the legacy of slavery and celebrate the culture of African Americans. So celebrate, educate, and masticate, because you know that food about to be too bomb, okay? Happy Juneteenth!
I like barbecue. Now, the title of this conference is Who Will Stand in the Gap? And the answer is, and it has to be, all of us. Because history isn't just the past. It's in everything we do in the present. and gives us the roadmap to what we could be in the future, which is exactly why we must fight for our histories to be heard. None of us can stand by and allow Black history to be brushed aside. Because history gives us so much, whether you want to fight fascism, dismantle systemic bias in policing, put historical context into your Texas barbecue, or figure out how in the world your great-grandpa raised 21 kids. History is there for you. Now, my entry into history was through my family's past, but I encourage each and every one of you to find your entry point into history. Because right now, history needs you more than ever, your story and your voice. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Khalil Greene. I'm also known as the Gen Z historian. It's a name I made up for myself when I finally became an influencer on social media as a way of branding the work that I do. And the reason why I like the name the Gen Z historian is because it's a bit of an oxymoron. When people think of Gen Z, they often think of youth, of the future, of progressive movement. And when they think of history, they often think of the past, of things that are archaic, of conservatism in a way. And my job as the Gen Z historian is to perform and to bring forth the best of both worlds. And that's what I hope to do with you all today. When I was told the theme of this conference is going to be who will stand in the gap, I took that question personally. And what I'm going to do for you all today is talk about the gaps that I see in the world and in the areas of history and social movement and how I go about standing in those gaps. But first, a bit of an origin story. So I was actually joking with Tori earlier that I have this theory that if something bad or something wrong is happening in America, there's probably a 99% chance that you can trace it somehow back to Yale University. And Yale University also happens to be my alma mater. So to bring it to current events, as we all know right now, there was the recent AP African American Studies ban in Florida, and that ban was executed by the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who graduated from Yale University and also got a degree in history. Once again, I graduated from Yale University with also a degree in history, so ironic enough. And also the College Board, which is the organization that changed their AP African American Studies curriculum to take out some of the best, most critical thinkers that were included in the curriculum. Thinkers like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, thinkers like bell hooks. The head of the College Board the president, was also a Yale graduate. But these are far from the only problems that existed at Yale University. And when I was a student back in 2017, a freshman at Yale, there were no shortage of issues on campus. And I came into Yale as a computer science major. So my story with history, unfortunately, doesn't go back to my youth as it does for Tori, and I'm very envious of all of the time that she spent learning about history that I wish I had. But my story rather starts in college with the social movements that were happening on campus. So to outline a few of those social movements, I want to first talk about the renaming of Calhoun College. So for anyone who doesn't know, Yale University is separated into 14 residential colleges, which are basically dormitory buildings. One of these dormitory buildings was named after John C. Calhoun, who was one of the fiercest advocates for slavery in the era right before the Civil War. Students rightfully had an issue with one of the buildings on campus that Black students and other students would live in being named after John C. Calhoun. So there was a student movement to rename this building on Yale's campus. And one of the founding principles of that movement was the realities and the effects, the modern day's effects of history and the importance of being historically aware of the world around us. People had to educate each other on who John C. Calhoun was and how his harmful policies extended and almost cost America and Black Americans freedom during the Civil War. Other notable people related to slavery that graduated from Yale include Eli Whitney. And for anyone who doesn't know, Eli Whitney was the inventor of the cotton gin, and this turbocharged the economic sort of benefit of slavery for slave owners and made them that much more advocates for the system of slavery. Another thing that was happening on campus was the defunding and the lack of funding for the ethnic studies program. This was a movement to get more funding for classes like Latin American studies and Asian American studies in the face of a university system that devalued the professors and the students that were studying this. And grounded in this movement was the history of the ethnic studies movement that happened in universities in California, where coalitions of people from different racial groups, whether they would be Chicanos who were American-born descendants of Mexicans or Mexican immigrants, or whether it would be Asian Americans or Black Americans through the Black Panthers, these groups came together to push for ethnic studies on university campuses, and that message was shared as the foundation for this movement. Another one included the protests of climate change that happened during the Harvard-Yale game, one of the most important events every year where Harvard and Yale have a football game standoff. And students stormed the field during the halftime performance to protest climate change and the effects of climate change, especially on marginalized communities. And grounded in this story was the history of the economic devastation that was brought upon marginalized communities, specifically indigenous communities when America was first colonized, and later on Black American communities in the face of segregation and the devaluation and defunding of the infrastructure of cities that Black people lived in. So within all of these movements, there was a clear role for history and the swaying of public opinion and the informing of people who were interested in taking part in these movements. And that goes into something that I realized, the sort of framework or the map for social change, as I like to call it. So the first thing that happens when there's a need for social change is that an injustice occurs. In the case most recently in 2020, this could be seen as the death or the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. After this, there's an important step where people raise awareness. The video goes viral. Tweets go viral, people talk about it, people are finally becoming aware of what happened at a very logical, factual, conceptual level. After that is an important part that I saw play out on Yale's campus and that I saw as a gap for me to fill in with social movements happening today. And that important step is to sway public opinion. And one important way of doing that is to add historical context to whatever social movement is happening at that time. And that's what I do now. After public opinion is swayed, usually this can morph into political pressure, where politicians are forced to reckon with the raised awareness and the protest movements and the logical arguments that are convincing them to make change. And the last and final step, ideally, is that justice is obtained, whether it be through the legal system or through whatever other system can repair and hold accountable those who committed an act of violence against someone else. So understanding the map of social change, as a college student, I realized that my specialty and my expertise, something that I could levy my skills toward, was once again swaying public opinion. And the first time I did this was by way of running for student body president and getting Yale to change in terms of its relationship with student activists and the administration's willingness to hear out the concerns of student activists, like those who were pushing for the renaming of Calhoun College, or the funding of ethnic studies, or the divestment of fossil fuels from Yale's corporation. And one thing that I did to sway public opinion in regards to these movements was to write an op-ed. So the first thing that you see on the side is a Yale Daily News op-ed that I wrote called Yale Together. And I wrote this in response to the cases of police brutality that not only happened at a national stage with George Floyd, but also those which happened on Yale's campus. So 4 days after I was elected the first Black student body president at Yale University, a Yale Police Department officer shot at an unarmed Black woman and her boyfriend after falsely suspecting them as perpetrators of a robbery a few blocks away. Stephanie Washington and Paul Witherspoon, as their names were completely innocent, and luckily neither one of them suffered fatal injuries. But at the same time, this shocked Yale's campus, at least the non-Black people on Yale's campus, because they thought that we were protected, that racism wouldn't happen at a university as quote-unquote progressive and liberal and woke as ours. So in this op-ed, I wrote for the need for the Yale community to come together to recognize that even in Yale blue, Black is still Black. And this was a resonant insight for a lot of students. Shortly after this, I was able to sway public opinion by writing an op-ed about only 4 months later, after the Trump administration sued Yale University on the grounds that our affirmative action policies were discriminatory against white and Asian students. And I rightly argued that this was a false claim, seeing as the need for affirmative action is to increase diversity on campus, which benefits all students. On top of this, I dispelled some of the myths about affirmative action in terms of it being a point or a quota system, which is factually untrue. Also, the opinion that a lot of people have that Asian Americans are hurt by it, or even white American students are hurt by affirmative action. And I called out the zero-sum mentality that was at the root of this conservative argument and why it wasn't true. Up the suit. I'm not going to say it was all because of my op-ed, but it was largely because of people who were able to sway public opinion about this issue. I went on later in life, and by later in life I mean like literally a year ago, to write in the Harvard Business Review about how businesses can incorporate young, diverse Gen Zers into their corporations. And I also gave an interview to Forbes magazine talking about something that I'm really passionate about now, which is the cultural appropriation of Black Americans on platforms like TikTok and the calling of Black American culture, whether it be Black American languages or African American vernacular English as it's commonly referred to, as Gen Z slang, even though it's not, and it's a specific language system attributable to African Americans that is often co-opted and monetized by other groups. Not soon after, I took this swaying public opinion through historical context and historical reasoning to other platforms like TikTok, where I wouldn't have to sit there writing 1,000 words worth of an article and hoping that it would get published, but instead I can in real time respond to events happening in the world and write these miniature video essays that could then circulate to millions of people. My first ever TikTok, which I released on MLK Day about 2 years ago, reached 1.3 million people in about 12 hours. The TikTok I'm going to share with you today is one that talks about a really important social issue that is the cause for poverty in many Black American communities, and that is called eminent domain. So I want you to hear this historical lesson, and I'm going to tie it to the modern day afterward.
Did you know that before Central Park was known as Central Park, it was the location of Seneca Village, a neighborhood full of prosperous Black Americans? At its peak in about 1855, the neighborhood had over 50 homes, 3 churches, a burial ground, and a school for Black kids. It provided a refuge from the violent racism encountered elsewhere throughout New York City. But in 1857, the city government used a law to take ownership of the property from the citizens who lived there. This law was called eminent domain. Eminent domain allows the government to purchase and remove someone from their property so long as they say it's being used for a public good. But as one scholar says, all too often the public good is equated with enhancing property values, while officials downgrade the interests of poor and African American communities. Take, for instance, another example that happened across the country. In 1912, a Black woman named Willa Bruce purchased land in Southern California in an area that would later be known as Bruce's Beach. After her purchase, more Black families moved into this area, but they also brought resentment from their white neighbors. White residents slashed the tires of Black homeowners, put no trespassing signs around surrounding areas, and the KKK even set fire to a nearby home. But when all of this still didn't get the Black homeowners to leave, the city government used eminent domain to seize over 24 homes. They said they needed to use it to build a public park. Today, it is estimated that the market value for the entire area would be about $75 million. In the 1940s, eminent domain was also used to take property from intern Japanese Americans, and later it was used to take property from Mexican Americans to build Dodger Stadium. As one legal professional says, it is mind-boggling to think about how many opportunities are missed when the government intercedes to prevent certain people from building wealth. If you learned something new, share this video, comment what I should explore next, and follow for more.
So that historical lesson can be applied to many different social movements, including the case for reparations that talks about how wealth was stolen from Black communities and needs to be returned to not only us, but the descendants of those who were victims because of the lack of generational wealth in the Black American community because of the government sabotage. It's also an important part of the decriminalization of Black people. And that connection is because so many police departments and criminal justice laws are put onto poor communities, and oftentimes issues of poverty or crimes of poverty like robberies or delinquency are attributed to bad behavior or just something delinquent and wrong with Black youth or Black communities. But as we see, oftentimes, in majority of the time, a lot of these crimes are associated with people who live in poverty. If you can't afford to buy food, then one reaction might be to steal food. And a large reason why this poverty exists is because of laws like eminent domain that seized Black wealth and left them with nothing, no matter how hard they work for it. I made so many other videos, and I continue to make these videos. I have about 200. I reached my 200th post on Instagram a few weeks ago, and they include all types of small video or short video essays about current events. For example, I have one about how the Black cops who killed Tyree Nichols were still operating under this larger system of white supremacy, and I explain how that works. I have one about the African American Studies ban, one on affirmative action that echoes some of the arguments that I shared from my op-ed. I have one about Black mermaids, and the context behind that is the casting of Halle Bailey as Ariel, and people saying that it was blackwashing the character. I have one about the myths about Black fathers, how most people say that Black fathers are not involved in their children's lives, or they misuse data about children being born out of wedlock to say that Black fathers are neglectful, and that's not true. The CDC found actually that out of all racial groups, Black fathers who live with their children are the most involved in their kids' lives. And lastly, I have one about monkeypox and how racism was the cause of that outbreak last year. And to really hit home the connection that I had between the swaying of public opinion and the swaying of a political response, what you see right here is actually a picture of a bunch of activist influencers who were invited to the White House by the president and the vice president to advocate on behalf of the causes that we talk about on social media. They saw a value in how we presented arguments and how we were the voice largely of our generation of Gen Z. And I could have made you play a bit of a Where's Waldo, but I circled myself actually, and you can see me in the corner right there with that big smile and the yellow circle around me. So to conclude, one important way of creating social change is by way of swaying public opinion. And the best way to sway public opinion is to add in historical context to make the argument in favor of what change you want to see in the world. If you want to see more examples of me, quote unquote, swaying public opinion, feel free to follow me on my Instagram or my TikTok and learn some hidden history. Thank you.
That was incredible. Let's thank our guests again. That was a great presentation. Now we are going to move to the Q&A section of our program. So this is an opportunity for you to ask questions of our guests, and we have two of our committee members who are there, Austin and Cameron, who will facilitate this. So if you have a question, please raise your hand so they can come to you and you can ask in the microphone.
Okay, so my question is for Mr. Khalil. With you being a former history major and the AP board banning African American studies and CRT being taken out of schools, and it was already whitewashed as it is / was, do you think history is bound to repeat itself?
Yeah, there's a common saying. Is this on? No.
I mean, I can hear you.
Okay. There's a common saying among historians that history doesn't quite repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what that means is that you'll see sort of the similar events happen. They'll never quite happen exactly as they happened before, but the context and the macro narrative, so like the larger story of what's happening, will sort of happen over and over again in a similar way throughout time. What I mean by that in this case is that oftentimes after the most progressive movements in favor of Black social justice, you'll see some of the worst forms of backlash. So after the Reconstruction era and the freeing of enslaved people was the start of the KKK. And often the violence and the vigilantism that was attributed to white Americans, especially in the South, who criminalized free Black people because they saw the loss of the Civil War and the freedom of enslaved Black people as a threat to society, an existential threat that warranted a new level of attacks against the Black community. After the Civil Rights Movement, and this is something we're not commonly taught, but after the Civil Rights Movement were some of the worst cases of sabotage by white Americans against Black Americans. We see in response to integration in schools, there are no shortage of pictures of young Black people like Ruby Bridges who were getting tomatoes thrown at them, who were having thousands and thousands of white families of all ages yelling at them, harassing them, attacking them. We even saw the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, the president of the Dallas Cowboys in one of those images. And then also after integration was fully legalized in the legislation of the Civil Rights Act, we started seeing more covert ways of enforcing racism, like white flight out of communities where white families would pick up and leave an entire community, entire neighborhoods when they started to see Black people living there. And because so much of the wealth was with these white families, when they left, then public infrastructure crumbled entirely. And this repeated this same sort of issue that necessitated integration in the first place. It was basically segregation all over again, a term called de facto segregation. So now, in this post-George Floyd uprising, post-Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery uprising, we're starting to see some of the worst cases of backlash in terms of attacks on Black critical thinking, on Black scholarship, on Black studies. So we are seeing history starting to rhyme, and I do think that we will continue to see that as progressive movements happen, that there will always be some sort of backlash.
I completely agree. I mean, you even see it in terms of not even just Black history. You see that with the Me Too movement, right after that, incels became a huge thing. There's always a response. And so I love that saying of it rhyming and not completely repeating itself. So we can see these patterns and we can hopefully catch them, and understand where they are when they're happening. But I don't necessarily think it repeats itself. I think it just rhymes. I agree with that.
My question is for both of you. What do you feel is the responsibility of higher education and university systems across the country to address these historical imbalances that we face in this country?
I think it's meeting people where they are and not teaching from on high. We were talking about this earlier. I think a lot of times, and I've experienced this, my degree is in Africana Studies, is there's a sense of that certain types of people hold the key to history. And I think understanding that history is not just the notable names that we know, it is the family member who was a farmer or, just lived down the street. Like, that's our oral histories that's important. And I think that's something that we've missed, because I think it's natural to focus on certain people. It's natural to focus on heroes. We see that through storytelling throughout the world. But I think history in general, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of mess, and I think we can learn a lot from that as well. And so I think holding space for that mess, for that nuance within our heroes and our villains is really important.
I think university administrators and faculty also have a part to play in the political climate that we have right now. There was a call from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was one of the critical race theory scholars who was taken out of the AP African American Studies curriculum, for university presidents to stand up and make a stand for education and critical thinking, because we can't just let governors and no politician on any side of the spectrum should ever have a authoritarian say over what's being taught in our classrooms. That should be 100% the decision of teachers, of educators, of people who are on the ground working with communities to actually inform them on how the world works. And as Tori said in her presentation, that is the #1 way to recognize the rise of fascism is people who are censoring counter narratives, who are saying there's only one way to think. And this should never, ever, ever be the case. And if it is the case, then it doesn't allow young people or anyone with intellectual curiosity to actually see where the gaps are, to stand in those gaps, because you're telling them that they are wrong for thinking outside the box, that they are wrong for challenging the systems that they see are bad and have issues with them, and that's never okay. So I think that's something that all universities, administrators, faculty, students, everyone in the world actually should stand up for, education and educational freedom.
Hello? Oh, thank God, I don't have to scream my question. My question is actually for you, Mr. Greene. It caught my attention earlier when you discussed Black cultural appropriation with like TikTok and advertisements and things like that. I apologize if this is a much more loaded question, but can you actually tell me some of the things you found in those studies? Because it just really piqued my interest a bit.
Thank you for that question. So I love cultural appropriation, or I love talking about cultural appropriation. And the reason I got into talking about it, because I feel like it was a conversation that was being had when I was young, especially around the time of the rise of Black Lives Matter. But I felt like it was so confusing. And I would see people go on YouTube who I would, in theory, agree with, but explain it so poorly that I feel like it came off making our side of the argument look even worse. So to give you very clear examples, one of the first choreographed dances that really put TikTok as a platform on the map was the Renegade dance. I can't perform it right now. I could, but it would be really bad. But it was a dance choreographed by Jelaya Harmon, who was a young Black girl from Atlanta who had choreographed a number of other dances. But when she did it and she posted and went viral, it really just took over the entire world. I don't just mean the United States, I mean the entire world. And added people who were sending it to their friends, had them download TikTok. However, the most famous person to do the Renegade dance was a TikToker named Charli D'Amelio. Charli D'Amelio was a white dancer a teenager as well, from Connecticut, I believe. She had nothing to do with the choreography, but for whatever reason, and the reason we can guess, as a young white woman, she became the face, and as many headlines will call her, the queen of TikTok, using Jelaya Harmon's dance moves to skyrocket herself without giving any credit to Jelaya Harmon. And no one, in terms of the entire system, that was of brands that were giving money to Charli D'Amelio, of broadcasters from the news who were hyping her up, they never did that extra research. And Charli D'Amelio went on to use a choreography of many Black choreographers and not give any credit to them. And this later on changed after the Black TikTok strike, which happened last year, and that's a movement for Black creatives to get more recognition, and so on and so forth. But there was a whole generation of white TikTokers, Charli D'Amelio being one of them, Noah Beck, her contemporary, Addison Rae as well, who has a Netflix movie, who literally got famous off of copying Black dance moves without any recognition to the Black originators. And those Black originators, if they're not nameless, we might know their names, but they have nowhere near the same wealth or economic opportunities as the people who copied them. And this is something that is replicated or rhymed throughout history with Elvis Presley and all of the Black originators in the South and the area we are right now, who he took inspiration from, not getting anywhere near the same acclaim or fame that he got or wealth, largely because of the racial dynamics at the time. And those racial dynamics have evolved, but they still rhyme nowadays.
I want to thank you so much for coming, but I have a question. I'm sure at some point your level of patriotism has been questioned because of spending time turning up the dark side of the history of our country. And so I wanted to know what your response is when someone questions that, if you consider yourself patriotic, what your definition of what that truly means.
I mean, I really do. I think like the narrative that people give to those of us who are racial justice advocates, at least the narrative that a lot of conservatives will give, is that we hate America. And I really love America, just not like in a Trumpy way. Like, I love America in that as a historian, I dive into so many stories about America, and every story has quote unquote heroes and villains and people in between. And the story of American history has a lot of villains and a lot of bad moments, a lot of tragedies, if you will, but that doesn't make them any less resonant and impactful and important, and any less a part of who I am and my identity as an American, with ancestors who were enslaved in the United States. So what I always tell myself and try to tell other people is that the story of America is not just of those people who committed these acts of violence, but it's also of the people who continue to resist them. It's of people like Ida B. Wells, who went down to the South to expose the lynchings that were happening and created an awareness for something that was so terrible that was a stain in American history, but that helped us progress further. It's on the history of America is these critical race theory scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined terms like intersectionality to highlight stains not only in the general racial dynamic of America, but also within the Black community of the treatment of Black women, of Black queer people, of Black disabled people, and allowed us to talk about these things. And that's so important because if we think of America as only these people who created these problems, and we see me highlighting or Tori highlighting these issues as un-American, then we're ignoring the history of all the people who stood up against those people, created awareness, and allowed for social change.
For me, it has evolved. I think when I first started getting into it, my patriotism was lacking. And then as I learned more, and I learned more personal stories, I said, I have every right to be a patriot. This is my country too. And I think it's a James Baldwin quote where he's like, I love America, which is why I have the right to criticize it. Why I must criticize it, because I want it to be the best that it can be. And I really do believe in the ideals, the American ideals. And I think it's also important to understand that in history, we're young. We're still young in the history of the world. And I think we're figuring things out. So I used to not be very proud to be an American. I was guilty of going to Europe and telling people I was Canadian. Thanks to Obama for changing that, then Trump for not changing it again. But I think now it is a deep love and a deep belief in the people of this country. And we see the best and we see the worst, but I really do believe at the core, America can be good. But I don't think we can be as good as our ideals unless we look back at history, unless we really come to terms with it. And I think a lot of times, I said earlier, I'm a mythology nerd. I think we believed in the myth of America, and that can make us jaded because we see that this is not the reality. But if you get closer, if you listen to people, if you really talk to people, the reality of America, of what we could be, is better than the myth. And then that's what makes me patriotic.
Hello. This is a bit of a loaded question, but in teaching critical race theory in schools, how would we go about teaching about Indigenous history in a way that doesn't, I think the term Indigenous is very America-focused because that term isn't most used in a lot of places around the world. So how do we teach that without focusing on one way to be Indigenous, if that makes sense? Because someone posed this to me earlier, but we don't start being Indigenous until we're colonized. I'm just curious as to how we would go about teaching that in schools.
Do you mind giving an example of, to elaborate, sort of like what gave you the context for this question?
Yeah, okay. So I grew up in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, I wasn't Indigenous. It wasn't special that I can understand a different language that isn't popular around the world. But here, it's kind of special. And here, I'm reminded constantly that there are layers to how I'm American, if that makes sense. So when I go about saying that I'm an indigenous person, but not indigenous to the US, that's a term that only Americans seem to understand, because I can't go home and say I'm indigenous. So how would we go about teaching indigenous studies or teaching about indigenous people in a way that doesn't seem so American focused, if that makes sense?
I think that's hard, because I think inherently, listen, I just said I was a patriot, but we inherently center America in everything. I think it is letting people who are from the countries or from the land lead that conversation, because I can't lead that conversation. That's not for me. So I think it is kind of passing the mic to someone who can. And I agree with you. I think there's a big push against pre-colonial, because it still like centers colonialism. And I think it's just giving people the opportunity to tell their stories from that point of view. It's going to be hard for Americans to not center ourselves, because I could go into the history of like rugged individualism. That's what we're used to. But I hope that there is a path. I don't necessarily know what that path would be, but I hope there is.
And at least from a lot of my peers who are indigenous to different places throughout the world and study indigeneity, I think a lot of people only understand indigenous identity in the context of settler colonialism, but there's different types of colonialism. So settler colonialism is when an empire goes about colonizing a place with the intention of removing the population and replacing it. So America is a settler colonial nation in that the British colonizers who took over the 13 colonies, their plan ever since day one was to replace the indigenous population, commit genocide, go from one coast to the other. Whereas colonialism did exist in Nigeria, it just wasn't in the form of trying to replace a population. It was trying to extract resources, similar throughout a lot of places in Africa. Another example of settler colonialism is Australia, where we see, and when we think of an Australian person, it's probably going to be a white person, but there was a dark-skinned indigenous population there. And they were probably more comfortable with using terms like indigenous or native or aboriginal, as they're called, because they were under a settler colonial empire. So just differentiating between settler colonialism and colonialism is an important way of conceptualizing indigeneity in its two different forms.
First, I want to just say that I appreciate both of you for coming out and speaking with us today. But my question is, I have it written down. What are your thoughts on using the idea of interest convergence, which is the idea that black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and black interests converge? What is your thoughts on using that as a way to combat American societal injustices and issues?
I don't think that's a great framework. I think there's a lot of aspects of racial justice that do benefit everyone. For example, the end of slavery codified aspects of the Constitution, amendments in the Constitution that grant freedom and citizenship to all Americans who are born on our soil, forbid slavery, of course, with the exception of people who are incarcerated. But those are good things that do benefit everyone. And there's a book by sociologist Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, and it talks about how a lot of racial justice provisions do benefit everyone. But at the same time, there's another book called Winner Takes All, The Myth of Win-Win, and that talks about how a lot of racial justice provisions actually will force people to make concessions, right? So the wealth that white America has is almost 9 times the wealth of black America. And in cases like the case for reparations or the case for certain legal protections and integration, sometimes these are not things that, at least in the immediate, will benefit white Americans. And they have to be grounded on principles of justice, equality, and fairness, as opposed to win-win. Because if they are, then anything that contrasts with what will benefit white America, which is a lot of things that will benefit black America, there will be a failing argument. So we just have to ground it in other values other than just trying to say that we'll only do things if it benefits both parties. Because unfortunately, when one party has a lot more resources and has been at least a part of or beneficiaries of the oppression of the other party, then you can't just expect all things to benefit both.
Thank you.
Nailed it.
Thank you for all that you have said and done tonight. It's amazing. But as I was listening to your discussion, some of the things you said causes sort of a flashback back with me. I'm 71 years old. A lot of things you're talking about I experienced personally, and especially when you start talking about the police brutality, why they're like they are today. A lot of it is ingrained in them really from childhood up because of how society has accepted and their own personal idea of thinking that this is not only how it should be, but it's how it's going to be. But I have noticed, and this is Dan talking, okay? The injecting of ideas and attitudes, I am seeing, and help me if I'm incorrect in this, I'm seeing how we are being redirected by the projection that advertisement is giving America. I'm kind of critical a lot of times in my thinking and observation. To me, several advertisements that come on television is projecting a negative concept toward Black America. For instance, and I watch commercials, I look at how if you're going to advertise a product and you have 2 or 3 people in your advertisement, whereas a Caucasian lady might be 110 pounds that they're using. A Caucasian white male, he might be 175, well built. But then there's a 320-pound black lady involved in the same advertisement. And nothing against her personally, but the projection that you're giving. If you're advertising and you show a black family, they're almost, and you show the household, is from almost the hood concept on the low end of the scale. In the same advertisement, on the other side, it's almost a Beverly Hills environment. The projection that you give, this is how we are, this is how they are. And so many advertisements, I'm looking at that as to how we are being redirected into thinking as if this is where we're supposed to be and this is where they're supposed to be. Our children look at it, everybody look at it, because this is what we see on television. And quite often, a lot of the things that we see on television, people believe it. And that's why they put it on television. That's why you advertise, because we want you to believe what we are saying. We want you to believe what you're seeing. And that's happening. Are you dealing with, are you seeing that, or is it just me? Okay?
I think you kind of touched on this with the Black Mermaids. I think a lot of times how any marginalized community is presented is as the other. So there is a limited space for us to move within that other. There's an idea of what Black people are supposed to be. There's an idea of what the queer community is supposed to be. And so I understand what you're seeing there. But I think can also happen there and is on the other side of that is kind of respectability politics of kind of touching on this is the way we should be seen as this upstanding instead of giving marginalized communities the opportunity to kind of take up space and grace within that. I had a friend who sent me a video about a critique of Black Panther, and there's a lot of critiques about Black Panther. And it was basically saying how we have made the revolutionaries the bad guy, and I completely agree with that. And I pushed back by saying, Ryan Coogler is held up to the standard of make the best Black movie. You have to represent the race. white directors get the opportunity, go have fun, explore, try and do a comedy, try and do that. And I think if you are a part of a marginalized community, a lot of times you're expected to be the emblem for that marginalized community. And that can kind of be a blessing and a curse, because I think we hold so much within ourselves, and we can present so many different types of people. And so I think there is kind of the other side of that, of giving, you know, the person the leeway to kind of explore their self-image, but also to understand that these images that we are being presented with are centered from whiteness, of presenting us as the other, as presenting us as a narrow view of what we can be.
I agree with that. And I think the solution is to have more Black people and Black creatives behind media. But that said, I wouldn't assume that every time, at least like for my personal view, that there is a Black person who might fit what we conceive of as a Black stereotype on screen, that they are only there to fit a Black stereotype. Because a lot of times, things that are stereotypical of the Black community can be true in part. So for example, there is a huge racial wealth gap, and a majority, if not a plurality of Black Americans are living in poverty. There's no reason to dehumanize them and to put them on screen as like the only representation, but that is a true condition, and I think the solution to that is to humanize a Black person no matter what their circumstances are. If they're an incarcerated person, it's fine to have an incarcerated person on screen, but don't make them a stereotype, a one-dimensional thug or villain, or whatever the case might be. And when it comes to fighting against these stereotypes and these representations in media, oftentimes it's actually reversed to an extreme that's also bad. So one example is the Bill Cosby show. And it was a great representation in terms of like when during its time period, it portrayed a middle-class Black American family, but oftentimes those expectations were also forced onto young Black people at an unreasonable level or unreasonable rate. The Bill Cosby show takes place during the crack epidemic in the same city in New York. But it obscures all of those realities for the sake of portraying a myth of Black excellence that's actually really in contrary to the lived experiences of most Black Americans, and also can feel pretty distant. So I think it's about having a balance in making sure that whatever you portray, however you portray Black people, it's not in a way that's pedantic or scolding or saying that you have to live life a certain way, and it also humanizes the experiences of whatever Black person or Black family is on screen.
Okay, so my question is for both of you, and I want to know, like, what is the one thing or the overall goal that you want people to get from your content when they come across it?
The overall goal for my content is for people to be able to answer a question that is talked about or asked often, but not well explained, especially in the context of racial justice or Black history. So for example, one video that I've made is, oh, why are Black fathers so absent? So I talk about the stereotypes and myths behind that, but then also the social reasons, the governmental reasons, the historical reasons for issues like father absence, in actual beneficial ways of tackling that problem, as opposed to just scolding and yelling at each other. Something else I talk about, for example, is most recently something that people were asking is, if it was 5 Black cops who killed Tyree Nichols, how can we blame racism or white supremacy? So I talk about how even going back to the times of slavery, there were always Black slave patrols and Black overseers who were tasked with enacting violence on other Black people to maintain the white supremacist status quo, and how that continued throughout history, even when it comes to cases like Emmett Till. There were Black men who were recruited by Carolyn Bryant's husband and brother-in-law or brother to kill young Emmett Till. There were Black men a part of that. So there were always Black soldiers of white supremacy, and that sort of historical reasoning to answer questions is something that I value, and it often allows for people to gain a new understanding of these really complex or controversial issues that they can then share with their family and convince, as opposed to share with them and confuse or just create more controversy.
I think for me, it's just to get curious. I tend to talk about, obviously my background is in Africana studies, but I talk about every kind of history. It really would be something that I'm just interested in. I wanted to learn about how the Navy was using dolphins as soldiers. And so I learned about that. And so I just think my hope, if anyone who views my content, and I make a fool out of myself on a lot of them, I've worn a fake mustache before, is just to find something that they're interested in and dive deeper into it. I think social media, the way it is built, is a surface level world. You're gonna get the bare minimum. I cannot go into all the nuance of every single subject in 5 minutes. It's just impossible. And so I think having someone watch my content and be like, I wanna learn more about that, and then diving in, that's all I could ask for. That's the ultimate goal. And I've had that happen where people have come back, and the greatest thing that's happened has been someone went back to school because they wanted to teach. Because they said, oh, you made it teachable. I understood it because you made it simple. That's the greatest gift I'll ever receive, other than The Rock knowing who I am. That is also up there. But yeah, curiosity. I peaked way too early.
Any other questions? I want to thank our guests. You've done a tremendous job explaining some of the complexities of social media and how you were able to get your messages out there. So I so appreciate you all coming and sharing this with our students and with our community. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I will ask our guests, Tori and Khalil, if you all have any closing remarks. If you do.
Just thank you so much for having us. It's been an honor.
Thank you, and value history. Get curious. It doesn't have to be the narrative that you see being taught during Black History Month or whatever the case might be. Whatever history interests you and whatever gaps, speaking of who will stand in the gap, whatever gaps in history you want to fill, go tackle that. Get on Google, go on Wikipedia, find real sources, and answer the questions for yourself.
Get curious.
Get curious. And we will end our evening with that. Thank you all so much.